Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray. I am your host today on your weekly fix of ancient warfare-related stuff. And this time we're getting very sophisticated because my answer follows on from last week's answer. So if you haven't watched last week or listened to last week, you can do that now or go back after I've spoken about it in this one. So not that we want the person to get greedy because I'm answering two questions a week after each other from the same person. But you, of course, can ask us questions too. You can ask them on Patreon. You can send us a message. You can send us an email, and we will do our best to answer the questions. And this one is again from Doug Fulkerson, and he asked us about the Battle of Crimisus. Crimisus. There you go, just to show that there are shibboleths everywhere. Fought in 340 or 339 BC between the Carthaginians, Asdrubal and Hamilcar, and Timoleon at Syracuse. So it's an interesting battle because it's essentially one of these Greek generals coming to Sicily and winning a great victory against the Carthaginians, who of course were seeking to conquer the island as part of their imperial expansion. And there's several reasons for that, which are worth exploring. And it's also doesn't last very long. Timoleon dies, and all of Sicily gets thrown into disarray after his death. So you've got an army of not many men. We're told that Timoleon gets 3,000 men and marches against the Carthaginians. And while on the march, 1,000 of his 4,000 mercenaries desert him. Hence, he's only got 3,000 men and return to Syracuse. So in total, he seems to only have 5,000 men and 1,000 cavalry. So he marches them for 8 days towards the river Crimisus. And the Carthaginians there are concentrating, and we're told that they have 12,000 men. So the first thing, of course, is that Timoleon is massively outnumbered 2-1, essentially. And Timoleon positions his army on a hill to start with and waits for the Carthaginians to cross the river and attacks them as they do so. So it's an interesting battle in the sense that he's using the terrain to his advantage, that the numbers of men, and of course this happens in multiple places in Greek and ancient history where you find victories are won by the smaller side using concentration of force, using superiority of troops and all sorts of things like that. And the other thing that's most interesting about it, and it's hard to know whether it's deliberate or accidental or just serendipitous, and that is that Timoleon uses the weather. So you would think that as a Corinthian who's been brought to Syracuse to command, who then marches his army away from Syracuse, he's not going to necessarily know the weather, whereas the Carthaginians are local to the west of Sicily and would know the weather, or whether Timoleon has some kind of advisor who tells him what the weather patterns are going to be. We're not told that exactly, but certainly in the start of the battle, there's a thick fog, which means that Timoleon can see the Carthaginian camp, and they can't necessarily see him. And it's noise that tells him that the Carthaginians are crossing the river. And so he's able to charge on in, at which point the fog dissipates. Knowing when the fog's going to lift and when it's going to clear is obviously something that locals do know. Now, the other factor is that at this point, when he's fighting the Carthaginians, there's a rainstorm. And there, interestingly, we would sit there and go, how often are battles fought in the rain in the ancient world? Not often is the answer. And the interesting thing, the other battle that's interesting is what's known as the miracle of the rain. That happens during Marcus Aurelius's wars in the 170s against the I think it's against the Marcomanni or the Isagides, I'm not sure, one of them. And they're parched and they're surrounded and they're not going to win the battle. And then all of a sudden the rain breaks out and it parches their thirst and they're able to win. In this case, however, the rainstorm is so severe and it's coming from behind the Syracusan army. So it hits them in the back, but it hits the Carthaginians in the face. And therefore, when the Syracusans are pressing their attack, they're able to rout the front line of the Carthaginians, and the rest of the army crumbles, which tells us something, and we can remember back from last week, that if that's an accurate detail, now it's Diodorus Siculus is the historian, writing around 50 BC, generally gets abused a lot, poor old Diodorus, for being uncritical of uses of his sources, which is slightly unfair because sometimes he uses very good sources. Other times he uses poor sources. And yes, indeed, he puts them next to each other and isn't necessarily critical, but that doesn't mean you can't use him. And in many cases, especially in the history of Sicily, but elsewhere too, he's the only source you've got. So abusing him as being useless is no good if you're going to make use of him, for instance. So he tells us that the front rank crumbles and the rest of the Carthaginians follow, which tends to tell us that the front rank may have been the best trained, best armored troops of the Carthaginians. That's possible. Not necessarily proven, but it certainly is possible. And that also mirrors what was happening in Thebes in the 4th century BC as well. And there's other arguments to say that the Carthaginians in the 4th century BC are copying what's happening at Thebes. For instance, in this battle, we also have the Sacred Band, and which gets massacred. So we also get the idea that we find in lots of other battles that he puts his Sicilian Greeks and his mercenaries on the wings, and he himself commanded in the center with his best mercenaries and the Syracusans. Now, interestingly, there, of course, that's opposite to what we get later, where the best troops are kept on the wings and the mercenaries and the other troops are in the middle. So he's got his best, most trustworthy mercenaries in the middle with him. Possibly, however, the Syracusans. Now, remember that some of the Syracusans went back to Syracuse. He's keeping them there to keep an eye on them, rather than the argument being that the Syracusans in the center are the best troops too. So they're possibly with his best troops, but they might be of suspect loyalty and there to prove themselves. So now, one of the other problems we've got in Diodorus is that he tells us about the Carthaginians using chariots, which is kind of, we don't think the Carthaginians use chariots. But anyway, what he tells us, of course, is that he tells his cavalry to ride past the chariots to attack the Carthaginian infantry in the flank. Now, if you get rid of the chariots, which are a bit problematic, and just say that he ordered his cavalry to ride past the Carthaginian infantry and then turn and hit them in the flank, that certainly makes a lot of sense. It's certainly something that we find being done in the 350s by Philip of Macedon, for instance, that he's doing exactly the same thing. So that certainly is a possibility. And again, it's something that we find other generals doing later, especially Hannibal. And he then charges the center of the enemy ranks with him leading from the front. Then, of course, we get this rainstorm, which makes them break. And so they can't fight. There's also the idea, of course, which, again, very tricky. So the storm hits, rain in the face of the Carthaginians. That's going to be hard enough. And then we get the story of the mud, which is like, well, it must have been a lot of rain very quickly to turn a Sicilian field in June into mud. And so we get this sort of literary picturesque story of the Carthaginians wearing heavier armor and therefore sort of floundering about in the mud and therefore hampered by their equipment, whereas the Syracusans are less heavily armored and therefore more nimble and able to inflict defeat. Probably unlikely, but it's one of those things that we kind of have in the sources, which is picturesque, but I doubt that it's actually what happened. So we're told, again, we get a bit of a clue. We're told by Diodorus that the Carthaginian army had a front rank of 400 men. Now, that's interesting, because if you've got 400 men wide. It's not very wide, because we generally think of the amount of space that a man takes as somewhere between 30 centimeters and 90 centimeters. So, it's a very small area on a battlefield that's taken up by 400 men. But of course, we're also told that it's 12,000 men is in the Carthaginian army. So that implies if they're 400 across, then they're not particularly deep. That's, gives us maybe a clue to the depth, but we're not sure. Of course, there might be other parts of the army that were not included in that. But we are told that there are 10,000, Carthaginian casualties, which, given that their army is only 12,000 strong, is massive casualties. And 3,000 of them are Carthaginian citizens. So it's a huge number of men. And that, of course, is one of the big defeats that leads to peace in Syracuse straight after this one. The Greek army then captures the Carthaginian camp, which again contradicts something else that Diodorus tells us, which he says that the rain is so heavy that it makes the river break its banks. There's no way the Greek army is crossing the river to capture the Carthaginian camp if the river has broken its banks. But anyway, and so what we've got is this idea that the Carthaginians and the Syracusans are fighting a battle. The details not as good as we would like, and we're told that the sacred band fought to the death. We're told that there's this massive number of casualties, which is very hard to reconcile. But it certainly is an interesting battle that is very unknown, but deserves to be better known. So I hope that helped, Doug, and thank you for your question.